So our next presenter is Dr. John Maass. Using period and modern maps and images, he will discuss the 1861 campaign and Battle of Bull Run, the first major battle of the Civil War. The campaign, which resulted in almost 5,000 combined casualties, shocked the country and dashed expectations north and south of a brief war. Dr. Maass is an education staff member here at the National Museum of the United States Army. We're thrilled to have him on our team. He received a bachelor's in history from Washington and Lee University and his Ph.D. in early American and military history at The Ohio State University. He served in the 80th Division of the United States Army Reserve and was a historian at the U.S. Army Center of Military History for 10 years. Dr. Maass is the author of several books and numerous articles on early United States military history, including The Road to Yorktown, Jefferson, Lafayette, and the British Invasion of Virginia, published in 2015, George Washington's Virginia in 2017, and the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, A Most Desperate Engagement in 2020. So with that, we will welcome Dr. Maass. So thank you. Welcome, John.
Okay, thank you, folks. Today we're going to talk, we normally do a battle brief here at the museum the first Tuesday of every month, and we follow it with the second Tuesday at a noon in-person presentation. So if you've tuned into those before, that's the format I'll be going with, but I use a lot of period maps and modern images to show a lot of these locations, and that we'll go through here as I talk about the battle. So I refer to this battle as a clash of amateurs, because really in July of 1861, these two armies that were involved, the Union Army and the Confederate Army, were very inexperienced. There had been some minor clashes leading up to the battle over the spring and summer, but the commanders were very inexperienced. The troops were also, and we'll see through a few quotes of how they reacted to the battle and also leading up to the battle. So to start out, let's talk about the three armies that were actually involved in this battle at Bull Run. Obviously, the Northern Army for the Union at the time was called the Army of Northeastern Virginia, not the Army of the Potomac. That would come later in the months following the battle. And that was commanded by Brigadier General Irvin McDowell. Not really one of the best picks that could have been made. There was some politics involved here. There were some other Union officers that were more senior to him that were not chosen. But for reasons of politics, Lincoln and General Scott, who was the overall commander, Winfield Scott, of the U.S. Army at the time that the war broke out, chose McDowell. He was a West Pointer, but he was not. He did not have a lot of experience commanding a significant body of men, which, as we'll see, was a factor in what happened. The Army of the Potomac at Manassas was a Confederate army, unlike the Army of the Potomac that was later on in the Eastern Theater. And that was commanded by the hero of Fort Sumter, Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, who was also in the West Point class of 38. And he had a great reputation because Fort Sumter was seen as a success. It surrendered. He was brought up to Richmond, and he eventually took over the Confederate troops in Northern Virginia, opposed to Washington, D.C. But again, he also did not really have a lot of experience commanding a large number of men in the field, which became a factor. He was also known for developing grandiose plans, which would have been remarkable to achieve even after 4 years of war, to say nothing of 4 months of war. Oftentimes his plans were submitted to Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, or Joseph Johnston once he joined at Manassas, and he had to be told over and over, it's a great plan, but unfortunately it's not workable. and that was true for most of the war. Probably the most experienced of all these generals was Joseph E. Johnston, who was a West Pointer. He commanded the Army of the Shenandoah, which was out in Winchester. I'll show you a map of this shortly where he was. So the combined Confederate strength in Northern Virginia, if you include the Winchester contingent of Joseph E. Johnston, was about 33,000 men, whereas McDowell had a strength of about 35,000, 36,000 men. But as you can see on the slide here, one of the things he did not do was put in all his men. That was one of the lessons that Lincoln learned over and over again from other commanders was you got to put in all your men. So they're roughly even at this point. Now, this map illustrates where the armies were. And so you can see Winchester is circled over on our left. That's where Johnston was. And at Manassas Junction is where Beauregard was with about 20,000 troops. Now, Manassas Junction, let me phrase this way. There was no town of Manassas in the Civil War. The town nearest to this place, this rail junction in Prince William County, was Tudor Hall, a very small hamlet. And the location that we call Manassas was actually Manassas Junction. It was it was a railroad coming in to it was the Manassas Gap Railroad coming into the Orange and Alexandria Railroad. And it was a perfect supply place. The bridge came over the Occoquan and Bull Run at a very narrow spot. So it was a very good spot logistically for the Confederates to use to amass their supplies in Northern Virginia. And you can see McDowell's position at Centerville right before the battle. Now, opposing Johnston at Winchester, you'll see off to kind of the top center of the map was a fairly large force under the command of William Patterson. He was a personal friend of General Winfield Scott, so he was appointed to that position. He was very timid. He was afraid of Johnston. Now, granted, he had very little equipment. At one point, he had no artillery. Wagons were scarce, hard to come by. So what he was doing out there was trying to pin Johnston in Winchester so that he wouldn't do the obvious maneuver here, which is to combine with Beauregard and fight McDowell on easy terms. And that was Patterson's mission. Scott emphasized this over and over again, but despite a few attempts to do so, Johnson managed to get the slip on Patterson and combine at Manassas Junction. Many of the troops of Johnson's force arrived at Manassas Junction while the battle was still raging and were moved into a position to literally follow the sound of the guns to reinforce Beauregard's army, and we'll see more in detail on how that worked. But as you can see here, the force that went through Ashby's Gap and the Blue Ridge marched to Piedmont on the railroad and then would be shuttled very slowly. The tracks were bad, the engine was worse, and so they really only made, at some points, they were only going 6-7 miles per hour. But a consistent maneuver over to Beauregard really was the key of the battle, as we'll see. Okay, so the two armies were gradually moving toward each other along Bull Run. Eventually, McDowell got to Centerville, Virginia, and there's a picture of Centerville from 1863 or 1862. McDowell was under a lot of pressure by Lincoln and congressmen and the press to do something. The country in the initial part of the war, war fever was up, enlistments came in, and there was a lot of pressure to go out and use the army and defeat the Confederates. And he felt pressured, he felt he wasn't ready, but eventually moved from the Washington, DC, Alexandria area to Centerville, which was a very handy location because of the road networks that gave him access to this. There was an initial reconnaissance that McDowell ordered to go from Centerville down to the middle of the map here to Blackburn's Ford over Bull Run. Bull Run was crossed by two bridges. One was a railroad bridge and one was the stone bridge. I'll show you a picture of that in a second. But there were a number of fords over Bull Run that could be used to cross the river and get at the Confederates. And McDowell was really trying to figure out which one to use. And so he ordered one of his division commanders, Tyler, to just kind of feel out the Confederate positions and see what you can find. And long story short, that we don't have time to in this presentation about all the details of Blackburn's Ford, but Tyler wound up making it almost a reconnaissance in force rather than just a scouting party. It became known to the Confederates as the Battle of Blackburn's Ford. Later on in the war, this would have been regarded as just a minor skirmish, but to these soldiers who had never been in battle before, this was really the first fight. Many of them emblazoned on their regimental flags had this as a separate battle. There's that old quip about the difference between a skirmish and a battle, and the joke is that if you're in the skirmish, it's a battle. Okay, and that's the way they felt about this here. Many of them wrote home and said, we fought the Confederates. They were not able to cross the ford, but at least they had some information about what was going on. So here's another a large-scale situation map that shows the plan. So we have on our left the movement from Winchester by rail to the Manassas Junction, where Beauregard's main position was. And you can see the red are the Confederate lines that were guarding various fords on Bull Run. And the July 18th battle skirmish near Mitchell's Ford and Blackburn's Ford is on the far right of where it says July 18th. So Beauregard had concentrated most of the Confederate Army on these lower fords by the July 18th skirmish at Blackburn's and Mitchell's Fords. He was sure that McDowell was going to cross the road there, Bull Run there. Never really explained why. He assumed that he knew exactly what McDowell was going to do. And Beauregard's plan was to advance his right flank across Bull Run and get at Centerville and McDowell and get to the east of Centerville, blocking McDowell away from his line of retreat. However, as they say in a council of war, the enemy gets one vote, right? So McDowell voted a different way. He also wanted to turn the Confederate flank by his right flank. So you can see the line of march that McDowell was planning on doing here was to take about 15,000 of his troops on a major flanking march around to hit the Confederate left flank and get behind it, where you see Sudley Springs right there, and with a diversion heading right to the Stone Bridge, which is on what you can see there, where it says diversion 21 July, and that was under Tyler. So he was going to fool the Confederates at the Stone Bridge, but really take a massive hike around the Confederate left flank and fall on their rear. Now, that sounds like a good plan if you're Stonewall Jackson, okay? Not as good a plan if you're Irvin McDowell. And remember, this is the first battle. Most of these troops on both the North and the South at this battle, they were unconditioned. So when we think of our armies today, they go through basic training. They do PT every day. They get in shape. They train all the time. In this era, there was no basic training. There was drill, and you were able to move as a unit, march as a unit. But as far as physical conditioning, most of the soldiers couldn't make 3 or 4 miles with a heavy pack and a musket and ammunition and their tents and their camp equipment, and add to the list what you want. So it was a very ambitious plan that McDowell had here, but that's what they decided to do. So again, Johnson decided at one point on July 18th, both the Secretary of War of the Confederacy, the President Jefferson Davis, and Beauregard all contacted by telegraph Johnston and Winchester and said, "Hey, you better come over here, because the Union troops are advancing. They're nearing Centerville, and we need to combine and defeat them near Centerville." Okay, so here we have on our left, we have the diversion. That was the division of Tyler. And where you see the red Confederate units near the road that says Evans there on your far left, that's where the Stone Bridge is. And the idea was to advance the division of Tyler with 8,000 troops toward the Stone Bridge to make what was called a demonstration, which meant a feint or an attack with artillery or musketry, but not to go directly against Evans at the bridge. And meanwhile, excuse me, the other part of the army with Heintzelman and Hunter of 12,000 men that was later augmented, they would go around the flanking movement that we just talked about. Now, they had a lot further to go than the diversion, but again, inexperienced, McDowell sent Tyler and the diversion down the Warrenton Turnpike from Centerville first, and they were so slow and encumbered by so many wagons and artillery pieces, including a very heavy 30-pounder Parrott gun, that they figured when they got to the bridge at Cub Run, the bridge would not support that heavy gun. So they had to stop everybody and fix the bridge in the dark. Meanwhile, the diversion, the main flanking maneuver, they're sitting at Centerville waiting for Tyler's division to clear, which delayed them significantly. This is a picture of the Stone Bridge reconstructed. It was damaged during the war. You can see that this is from the west side of the bridge on the Confederate side, looking toward the northern positions. And you can see it's higher ground up there. That's where they put their artillery, including the 30-pounder piece, which I don't want to give away the ending, but in the retreat on the way back, that did not quite make it all the way to Washington. Okay. Another thing you can notice here, the banks of Bull Run in this area are very steep. And that became a factor in the battle, that they couldn't just move across this fairly shallow stream because the troops couldn't get down the banks, and certainly not artillery or any horses and wagons. Okay, so the Union, if you look off toward our right, you can see again, the flank attack, and it goes off our map and then comes back down, so that where you see at the top left, Sudley Springs Ford and Sudley Mill, Sudley Church, that's where the flanking attack came up behind the Confederate lines. And I've marked where the Stone Bridge is with an orange arrow. McDowell had managed to get in across Bull Run and was coming up behind Evans. So, miracle of miracles, at a certain time in mid-morning, McDowell had managed to get his force exactly where he planned, which was on ground behind the Confederate position at Stone Bridge. The positions you see of Bartow, B, and Evans, that was later, but just imagine you're McDowell and you've pretty much pulled off your flanking maneuver, and now you're in the rear of the left flank of the Confederate Army. Well, what happened was there were some signal stations, flag stations put up by the Confederates, towers behind Bull Run, so that they could communicate over a distance of about 6 miles. And the commander of that detachment of signal folks, E.P. Alexander, when he was trying to signal the Confederate signal tower near Matthews Hill, he could see the sun shining on the brass cannons of the Union column and their bayonets and other equipment, and signaled to Evans, who was at the stone bridge, saying, watch out for your left, you're turned. Which Evans quickly realized that he now had a big problem, and that the Union troops were not coming over the bridge to attack him, but he had to react to what was behind his flank. And of course, the Beauregard at this point saw the problem too, once he was notified. And this started this kind of process during the rest of the battle, where Confederate units from downstream were steadily fed into the battle against McDowell behind their lines piecemeal. Sometimes it was brigade by brigade, and you can see in this case down at the lower part of the map, that's Thomas, later Stonewall Jackson, coming up, having been downstream and ordered to the fight. The Confederate Army was mostly made up of brigades. They did not really have a divisional type structure like the Northern Army did at this battle. So you really had a bunch of brigades led by Beauregard and fed into the battle. So again, Burnside, Franklin, Porter, these divisions, they soon took up high ground on Matthews Hill, where you see Burnside here on the map. That's where he went to, was Matthews Hill, and were eventually confronted by several Confederate brigades in that section of the battlefield. This is a few illustrations here. This is a Sudley Springs Ford. McDowell's entire flanking column came across at this location. The road you see here, this is an original part of the road, and you can see it's fairly narrow, but you would be able to get artillery through that. And McDowell's flanking column did have a significant number of guns with them. Okay, so this is again, the morning. You have Burnside. You can see Burnside and Porter are on Matthews Hill, being reinforced by Heintzelman. More Confederate brigades are being brought up to the Matthews Hill area. Jackson down below. Evans shifted his troops up to Matthews Hill, leaving only a few companies of South Carolina troops in case the Northerners meant it to come across the bridge. But this is before noon. This was the situation. And again, Beauregard waiting for more troops to come from Winchester by rail. This is the scene today at Matthews Hill. This is part of Manassas National Battlefield Park. Many of you have probably been there. For those who haven't, most of the park consists of the northern half of the battlefield. The parts down by Blackburn's Ford from July 18th, those are not much of that is really saved at all. So anyway, this is the northern guns looking toward the Confederate position, which was in or at or near the fence row that you see right there. One of the key leaders here was Ambrose Burnside, not Sideburn, Burnside. And he had Rhode Island troops with him. And the governor of Rhode Island was with him too. The governor came down and said, if men from my state are going to be fighting a battle to save the Union, I'm going with them. So he was on the battlefield in uniform during most of this early part of the conflict. And this is an illustration of the fighting on top of Matthews Hill, which eventually the Federals were able to push the Confederates off of this position. So this is an image looking from that cannon line I just showed you at the Confederate position. For some reason, when Evans, who had been guarding for the Confederates, when he was guarding the bridge and came up the hill, he did not occupy the top of the crest of the hill. He was slightly down from that, mostly so that the Union troops, when they would crest the hill, would be silhouetted. But there were far too many Union troops on this hill for that really to work. So eventually the Confederates were pushed back. And in the far distance where it sees Henry Hill, can you see that white structure underneath the word hill? That's the National Park Service Visitor Center on Henry Hill. That's where the Confederates were sending their troops once the Union Army had pushed Confederate brigades off of Matthews Hill here. All right, so this is actual later portrait of Jackson from later on in the war. The Confederates eventually occupied Henry Hill, and that's where they were shifting a lot of their troops. Beauregard was there at Henry Hill for a time. Johnston, when he came up from Winchester and joined Beauregard on the battlefield, actually outranked Beauregard and should have taken command at that time. But Beauregard insisted that since he had been there for however many weeks and had known the terrain and Johnston didn't, that it would be better if he led the command, the actual combat. And eventually Johnston agreed, although he was pretty miffed and kind of peeved about it. He went back toward Manassas Junction to direct the incoming of the troops. The Beauregard and Johnson argued for weeks after the battle too, and Beauregard and still thought he had a command role in the army, and telegraphed to Richmond for an explanation of who was really in command. And he got a snarky response. They didn't say snarky in 1861, but he got a snarky response that said, "You are second in command of the entire army, not first in command of half the army." Okay, so he had to be counseled on his exact role. But this is on Henry Hill. This is the Confederate line. They had a lot of artillery at this position, and Jackson had a full brigade of Virginians, and including an artillery battle, the Rockbridge Artillery, attached to his brigade. And the Confederate units that were broken and heavily engaged and needed to be reorganized were basically doing that on Henry Hill behind this position toward the trees that you see behind the cannon. But this is where the Confederates occupied, and this is where the battle would be decided later on. Now, you can see where Henry Hill is and the Confederate positions in red. The Union advanced there, but a curious thing happened is that once McDowell had driven the Confederates off of Matthews Hill, he could really look back and say, "I'm actually winning this thing," right? He had brought his men around the flank. He had routed part of the Confederate army. He was in their rear. He had artillery. He had leaders with him, and he's winning. He's winning by halftime, right? Well, the curious thing was that he decided to pause at this time and pause for about 2 hours. They did not advance. And that gave his troops, who probably weren't arguing about the 2-hour break, they were given a chance to refit, regroup, get some water from Young's Branch, and right where you can see that runs into Bull Run, be resupplied, get more ammunition, what have you. But while you're resupplying your army, the enemy is also resupplying and regrouping and refitting. And this pause really was a key mistake on McDowell's part, which he never really explained himself personally afterwards. There was a commission, a congressional commission after this battle to figure out what had happened, and he testified at that congressional committee, but was not did not go into detail. But if we look at the Confederate side, they're on Henry Hill, and they're bringing their troops up from Manassas Junction and the lower fords, because by this time, Beauregard and Johnston knew that this was going to be the main part of the battle. So at about 2:00 p.m., roughly, McDowell began to advance his troops down off of Matthews Hill, which you can see up top, and Dogan Ridge, where you see the word Porter, and Dogan Ridge on your left, down the hill to the Stone House. Most of you who have either driven by Manassas Battlefield or visited know where that is. And he ordered an advance toward the Confederate position on the hill. One of the things he did was to order 2 batteries of artillery, Union artillery, under Griffin and Ricketts, who each had 6 guns each, to quickly advance down Sudley Road and up on Henry Hill and start blasting away at the Confederates. But he did not order any artillery support for them, which is infantry. Artillery is very, very vulnerable in a 19th century battle, today also, if they're not supported by infantry to prevent the enemy from attacking your batteries. Griffin and Ricketts vehemently objected to this plan, but McDowell sent back word saying, "Obey my orders." Now, why did he do it? Well, it's a little difficult to tell, but many of these officers who on the northern side and southern side, who had been at West Point, they were steeped in Napoleonic tactics. And one of Napoleon's main tactics on the battlefield was rush your artillery to the center and start blasting away. And that's fine if the enemy is using smooth bore flintlock muskets that only have a range of 100 yards. If your cannon has a range of 500 yards and the enemy's musket goes 100 yards, do the math, right? I'm not a mathematician, that's why I'm in history, but it seems like that's a good formula for not getting shot. So in this battle here, though, the rifled musket had quite a different range, and the Confederates had their own artillery. So we can't really go into all the details about the movements on Henry House Hill, but it became an artillery duel at very close range, and I'll show you a picture of how close it was, and you can see for yourself, while the Confederates are getting reinforced. Now, meantime, you can look in the middle of the screen here where it says Keyes. Keyes had another brigade that he brought over from the other side of Bull Run and attacked the Confederate right, where you can see it says Hampton, but he was unsupported, and he had 4 regiments in his brigade, but only used 2 of them. And this is another example of kind of this amateur nature of how the battle was being fought. They were putting in units 1 at a time or 2 at a time, while the other folks in ranks just stood around and watched. They did not try to pressure both flanks at the same time. McDowell finally ordered more brigades from across the Stone Bridge to try to put pressure on the Confederate right flank. So this is one of the guns that is on the battlefield that is positioned where Griffin and Ricketts were, and the Confederate artillery, it's a little bit difficult to make out in this slide, but if you see that lone cedar tree there, a little bit to the right of the cannon barrel, and then you have the tree line, the Confederate artillery was in advance of that tree line. That's close for artillery. It's very, very close in. Whether they're shooting canister, grape shot, solid shot, exploding shell, it's very, very, very close. And you would really not want to be an infantryman there either. This is another view from the Union position toward the Confederate line. You can see that, again, the Confederates were up against that wood line in the rear, slightly in advance. And this is where the back and forth went for the afternoon, from roughly about 2 o'clock till about 4 o'clock p.m. This illustrates the advance from the Confederate side. That's the lone cedar tree you saw earlier. That's it on the left. That is the reconstructed Henry house. The Henry house had the Henry family lived there. There was an one of the older family members, a woman from the Henry family. Was the younger family members tried to evacuate her because there was artillery coming through the house, which, as a rule of thumb, if you have artillery coming through your house, it's time to evacuate. However, because of her age, she didn't want to move, and she was actually killed inside the house. She was the only civilian casualty at the battle. So Griffin and Ricketts were on both sides of the Henry house on that ridge there, and the Confederates were trying to attack. The battle wound up going for quite a while, back and forth. The guns were retaken, then captured again by the Confederates, and eventually I'm going to go back to this map where you see the so the road, the Sudley Road, which goes up and down here. You can see on the bottom Bald Hill and Stewart. That's where the road is, and in that position there, it's sunken down. Those of you who've been there, you know that road is sunken down from the banks, and so it was a good causeway to advance troops. And gave them quite a lot of cover. And from that sunken road of Sudley Road there, which you can see is just beyond the first split rail fence, that's where the Union regiments kind of lined up to attack up onto Henry Hill. Eventually, the number of Confederate brigades who were coming onto the field gave them a decided advantage. And as I said earlier, when I showed the slide on the number of troops involved, only 18,000, 19,000 of McDowell's 36,000 troops, roughly half, only half made it to fight in the battle. And this kind of illustrates it because there were quite a number of troops that came over the stone bridge and were not engaged. But the Confederates were able to march to the sound of the guns, get a line going here, and they forced the Union infantry off of Henry Hill. Then they sent troops to their far left. You can see on the bottom left of our screen here, the brigades under Early and Elzey, Kershaw. These troops had come from the valley and attacked the Union right flank on Chin Ridge, which had been occupied by Howard, who was later famous for Gettysburg and as the director of the Freedmen's Bureau. They were victorious. They forced them off the ridge, and this precipitated a retrograde operation, which in the Civil War was called a retreat. And the Union Army actually was fairly intact at this point. They did not really panic at this point in the game, but the Confederates were clearly pushing them back across Young's Branch in order to finally win the battle. This is a view from the Confederate position on Chin Ridge. And so Henry Hill would be off to our right, the modern visitor center off to our right. Matthews Hill is to the kind of to the far right behind these trees. And this was where the final battle, the final fighting took place. So here's a modern and contemporary view. I'm sorry, 1861 and modern view of the Cub Run Bridge. Now, the Cub Run Bridge, if you remember, was back towards Centerville, and part of the Union Army was retreating back towards Centerville. The Confederates were able to bring some artillery and some infantry in the modern view on the top of that hill behind, on the other side of the bridge. That was all clear. And they started lobbing shells at the bridge because that was where the choke point was for all the retreating Union wagons, cannons, and infantry. And as luck would have it, they hit a wagon, the first or second shot overturned it, and other wagons and cannons and horses piled up behind it. And then that's where the panic started. So it was a rout by that point. But the modern bridge there, you can get down to it a little bit. There's some signage there, but and a historical marker, but you can't get much closer than where I was when I took this picture. So the Northerners were defeated, and the casualties here, the Union Army lost almost 2,900, Confederates almost 2,000. And with the short amount of time, I'll just take a couple of first-person accounts to really kind of emphasize the nature of how the soldiers looked at their first battle. One Union soldier before the battle, the night before the battle, who was at Centerville, wrote, "We are all well and feeling first rate, longing for the drum to sound that bids us on to victory or death. We shall take Manassas or die before tomorrow night. I never felt better in my life. I fear death as much as the sting of a bee." He was one of the men who was running across the bridge, actually, after the battle. One of the Confederate soldiers from Virginia who was at that Blackburn's Ford skirmish, he wrote after the first shell from a Union artillery came at them, said it was making a noise that cannot be described, but then he goes on to describe it. It was more like the neigh of an excited or frightened horse than anything I can compare it to, a kind of wicker, wicker, wicker sound as it swapped ends in the air. Then one soldier from the 11th Massachusetts Regiment, he wrote on regarding Henry Hill, "There was men laying dead and wounded, and the artillerymen had been killed, and the horses were all dead, piled together by the cannon. The bullets were flying thick." So just a couple of examples, but the main focus I hope to convey was the amateur nature of this battle, and the soldiers' experience in the battle, how they reacted, particularly the leadership. So with that, I'll conclude. I'd be happy to take any questions.
What were General McDowell's movements on the battlefield? Did he go with the flanking force, or did he try to get some central location and not cross Bull Run? And can that account for a lot of his confusion on his side?
He was with the flanking force. He was with them when they paused. He was at the advance, and he had a fairly good control of the flanking force. So when they got to Matthews Hill, he also had the hill on the other side of Sudley Road occupied too, which was a good artillery position. And he was also joined later by a brigade under Sherman, William T. Sherman was at this battle. And so my interpretation is that he was able to maintain command and control. His mistake was that pause that I mentioned before. And at that point, his decision to send the artillery batteries unsupported, and also the kind of piecemeal deployment of troops brigade by brigade instead of putting all the men into an attack at one time.
Can you speak to the civilians that came out and watched this battle as
Sure.
spectators?
Yeah.
Spectators.
So the question was about the civilians who were spectators at the battle. Contrary to popular belief, most of them were quite a ways away from the battle. They had come out to Centerville, and I showed this slide. A lot of them were in the Cub Run Bridge area. One of them was a congressman who got caught up in the stampede and was captured, had to spend a little bit of time, several weeks or months in prison in Richmond before he was exchanged. But this kind of illustrated not only the amateurish kind of nature of the battle, but just that this was a pageant and that people wanted to see what was surely going to be the only battle of the Civil War. That was very commonly thought of. In fact, some of Johnston's troops from Winchester who were being shuttled from Winchester, then on the railroad, were beside themselves, thinking that they weren't going to make it in time for the battle. I mean, they wanted to be there. They were really confident, and so you had civilians too, and this really was the last time you would see something like that. But those of you know the story of Fort Sumter, civilians were on top of the roof in Charleston watching the spectacle. It was just something to see. Nobody wanted to miss that. Got some others here.
Would you comment about some of the journals that were written that period by people who lived in Alexandria? In Wilton Woods, for example, the resident there wrote how about they heard the gunfire throughout the battle. And then when she woke up the next morning, her fields were covered by soldiers who had through the night run and basically deposited their stuff. This was in the area of Wilton Woods, right outside of Alexandria. I believe they probably would have come on Little River Turnpike.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm not familiar with that diary, but I've seen it used as a source, and you're correct. The roads leading back from Centerville, once the Army could get back to Centerville, they took a number of roads trying to get back to Washington. They wanted to cross the bridges into Washington because they knew, a lot of the soldiers knew that's where the food was. You know, whether or not you could hear the cannonade from Manassas in Alexandria, it's probably true. They said at Gettysburg, you could hear the guns from Gettysburg and Baltimore. The soldiers, a lot of them wanted to get to Washington very quickly. And some of the things that were impeding their progress were their muskets and cartridge boxes. So those got laid aside pretty early, and I'm sure they weren't really worried about that. But there are a number of accounts of what is now kind of the Arlington area and Alexandria up by the bridges and what's now Chain Bridge area of just tons of stuff left all over the place. Now, one aspect of this that I didn't mention was after the battle, the Jefferson Davis actually appeared on the battlefield. He was so anxious about what was happening, the telegraph just wasn't cutting it. So he took a train to Manassas Junction and gets to Beauregard and Johnston, and if you can picture the three of them together on Henry Hill after the battle's won, and several of the lower ranking Confederates, they wanted to keep chasing the Yankees. But you remember that old expression that the only thing more disorganized than a defeated army is a victorious army. And that was true. The Confederates had suffered a lot of losses, and they were disorganized, and it was getting dark, and they did not pursue it. But the next several days, they collected a lot of the arms and equipment that had been left over. Thank you. All right, sir.
Yes, sir. A question from a leatherneck. How in the world are U.S. Marines getting involved in there? I saw that they were with the Minnesota unit in New York,
Correct.
and how they didn't seem like it's a sort of out of place.
Well, first of all, how did you get in here? So there was a contingent of about, and Rob can probably give me the numbers, but there's a contingent of about 100 Marines, and they were with the flanking maneuver. And there's some signage at Manassas battlefield just about the Marines and where they were. Once Jackson attacked, they fled almost immediately. However, in the defense of the Marine Corps, these were recruits who were brand new, untrained, and some of them had only been with the Marine Corps for 2 weeks or something like that. So They would have been in the Navy Yard, I'm sure, yeah. Several of the other regiments in like the 71st New York or the 73rd New York had been at the Navy Yard and were brought from the Navy Yard to the battlefield. They brought with them two what were called boat howitzers to the battlefield with them because they were laying around in the Navy Yard and they figured they could use them. Okay, one second. Got one more?
Could you comment on McDowell's career a little bit after this battle? Because he sticks around for a while.
He does. So the question again is, what was McDowell's career afterwards? So he was relieved of command, and that's when George McClellan came in and turned the army around and organized it and better spirited. McDowell had a variety of positions. He was involved in the 1862 Peninsula campaign, where McClellan came up at Richmond along the James River on the peninsula between the James and the York. And McDowell was in Northern Virginia and was seen as a threat because McClellan was coming up the James River Valley and McDowell was coming at Richmond from Fredericksburg. It was a serious threat that had to be countered because they would have overwhelmed the Confederate numbers, and Lee would have had McClellan in front of him and McDowell off to his north. And to prevent that from happening, you may remember, that was the genesis of Stonewall Jackson's 1862 Valley Campaign, to get McDowell to go back into Northern Virginia and the Valley. And he also participated in the 1862 Second Manassas Campaign as well.
Okay, we have another question from Zoom. Where did the Confederates get their artillery?
Well, there were arsenals in the South during the war. Harper's Ferry, for one. In Richmond, there was a cannon foundry along the James River. Some of them were captured. And there were also lots of Confederate militia units from before the war, and some of them had artillery as well. So the Northern artillery was usually was superior in quality from the Confederate as far as ammunition was concerned, and the Confederates really relied on a lot of captured ordnance.
So yes, I'm a Marine, but I'm the son of an Army cavalryman. So I saw on a couple of your maps and illustrations that you had Stuart's Confederate cavalry look like they were in blocking positions or supporting the flank. Did the Union have any cavalry?
There was very little Union cavalry at Manassas. I can't tell you exactly numbers and units, but they did not make use of cavalry. And Stuart's command was very small at this point. He had a very small contingent. Again, the role of cavalry had traditionally been scouting and intelligence gathering, and the kind of large scale Confederate cavalry attacks and movements like that really didn't play into the plans or the logistics here. So that's a good question. Very good.
In your first slide, you had Longstreet at the Stone Bridge. That was the last time we heard of him on these.
Longstreet was not at the Stone Bridge. Longstreet was
there he
down
is right
here
there.
at Blackburn's Horn.
Okay,
That's not the,
okay, sorry
yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
What happened to him? He didn't show up in any other part of the battle at all. And the
So-
second question is, tell me about the Union use of railroads, either moving into Manassas area or evacuating wounded.
So Longstreet's brigade mostly stayed in this area for the battle. There were still Union units down here, so for a lot of the day, they did not know if the Union troops were going to come across these fords here. So we don't really see Longstreet on Henry Hill or Matthews Hill at all. As far as the railroads, so McDowell really was headed for Centerville rather than Manassas Junction because of the road network. So on the Union side, the railroads didn't really factor in to the plans, other than one Union division was sent down the railroad from Alexandria toward Manassas Junction. But in order to get at Bull Run, the roads in that area were scouted out and seemed to be too poor, too narrow, too rough, that they did not factor in as far as the Union divisions going at the Confederate right flank along roads and trails.
And what do you think about the fact that the Confederates learned the wrong lesson from this battle?
What do you think the wrong lesson was?
They thought that they came out of this battle thinking they were better than they really were,
Mhm.
and so they didn't have to quite prepare as much. Whereas the Union came at it with the idea they've got a lot of work to do.
Well, well, nothing succeeds like success, right? They won the battle. They had been saying for months that one rebel was worth 10 Yankees, right? The Southerners were farmers who were used to muskets and horseback, and the Union troops were a nation of shopkeepers, to paraphrase Napoleon, and immigrants, and things like that. Interestingly, and I think this would kind of support your point, Beauregard and Johnston were really heroes after this. They were kept on in key commands, especially Johnston. I think the person who learned the most from this battle was Lincoln. And Lincoln saw that he had to get smart on military matters. And he had to get some good commanders. And he thought he had a good one in McClellan. But I think you're right. The North did do a lot of lessons learned kind of analysis. And as I mentioned before, had a congressional committee to figure out what went wrong. And the South didn't have anything like that. Okay.
Outside of some possible artillery, was there any regular army participation, or were they all still out west fighting the Indians?
There were some regular army units on the battlefield, yes. Thank you. Okay, I think we have to wrap it up.